Dwarves. In art. You probably can't think of any, but they are there, and a lot of them. In relics from the ancient world, in your garden, and most of all, in paint and ink. Dwarves have also been the stuff of folklore, fairy tales and myths for thousands of years.
7-year-old comes up to me and says, I thought there were 7 dwarves. Mate, there were more than 7. Is it? You know, mind blown.
What can our greatest works of art and our most deeply embedded myths reveal about society's shifting attitudes to dwarfism? And can they tell us anything about the lives of dwarves themselves?
We have joy, we have fear, we have sex. We're just little.
Throughout history, dwarves have been shown as royal pets, creatures from a separate race, figures of fun, and freaks, making it all but impossible for people with dwarfism to simply get on with their everyday lives. But are we getting any closer to dwarves being represented like everybody else? And can artists with dwarfism offer us a glimpse of the world from their perspective? In this film, I'm going to be uncovering a hidden chapter in both the history of art and the history of disability. When I was a child, I caught polio, which was kind of unfortunate because it had been pretty much eradicated everywhere apart from where I was. I caught it before I was old enough to be vaccinated, and it left me with this withered arm, which I like, and a twisted spine. Now, I spent many months in hospital with doctors trying to fix me, and they couldn't. I've also had a lifelong tussle with mental health issues. So whatever discomfort or difficulties my disabilities have caused me, both physically and emotionally, the one thing they have done is they've left me with a distinctive perspective on the world. I've always been intrigued by the way that people with disabilities have been portrayed in art and culture. And surprisingly, it's people with dwarfism that you see the most. I suppose it's because it's a condition that can't be hidden and can't be denied. We're looking at each other, making judgments about each other all the time. If you look different, and let's face it, dwarves look very different, people stare even more.
Excuse me if I flash anybody. It's always the danger of little legs on a chair.
As a stage and screen performer, actress Corinna Stammel is used to being looked at. It's what she does for a living. Today, she's being stared at in a different way, sitting for a portrait for the first time with artist Tanya Raba-Weber. Do you feel you need to look back at someone who looks at you, or do you just ignore it?
When I'm walking down the street, they're people that have never met somebody that looks like me.
Yeah.
So you kind of get the oh my God eyes, or you'll get the double take. Mm-hmm. And so you become aware that you're being looked at. People who are ignorant will often make a show of they're looking at me, and there's a little bit of a power trip involved of, haha, you're different, I'm looking at you. It's sort of that same feeling sometimes of being pointed at.
We rarely meet people with dwarfism in day-to-day life, so we can't help but be conditioned by the images of dwarves we've absorbed through centuries of representation in art and culture. Representations that go back to the founding of European society. It's in ancient Greece and Rome that the insidious idea of dwarf as spectacle first reared its ugly head. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford has some of the earliest evidence of the dwarf's image being harnessed by society for its own gratification.
Hi Marianne, how are you?
Marianne Bergeron is curator of the Classical Greek collections.
Dwarves were portrayed as caricatures. They're seen as lesser people, as novelties, and they're depicted as such. Here is a sherd from a stemless cup depicting a dwarf dancing on a podium.
This feels like the beginning of a dwarf being comic, entertainer.
A tool for entertainment. What we have here is a wine jug. Would you like to hold it?
I would. I'd like not to drop it as well.
We have a dwarf portrayed as a satire. Satires are associated with debauchery and drunkenness and wild sex. A satire chases after women who have consumed lots of alcohol.
Chases drunk girls.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're saying, really, here.
So, yes, except that satires never catch their object of desire, and so they are always left unfulfilled. Now, this is much later than the other pieces.
It's definitely a dwarf. It's got the proportions, it's got the achondroplasic kind of look to it. Enormous penis, I must add.
That goes with the whole idea of caricature, of grotesque. You emphasize the elements that would make someone un-Greek.
So we're saying that most Greeks had small penises, so therefore all the non-Greeks must have to have huge penises in order to delineate them from the normal Greeks.
Yeah,
I feel sorry for the Greeks.
But that was their ideal.
So they portrayed this figurine of a dwarf to have large genitals in order to show that it was not a proper person?
Yeah, he was less of a person than...
The ideal Greek.
Exactly.
Rome was famous for public spectacles, the Colosseum, the circus. I mean, were dwarves used in this context?
We hear of them battling women who we think were probably representing Amazons. That created the comedy for spectators in the arena.
Overall, the message that I'm picking up here is that people with dwarfism in both classical Greece and Rome were exploited.
Absolutely. They were considered less than normal, less than human almost, and were there to please.
This depiction of dwarves for comedy and spectacle is evidence of the negative attitude towards disability at the heart of European civilization. I think these representations say more about society than they do about dwarves, but they've left us, in the Western world at least, with a distorted perception of people with dwarfism. But was this ridicule inevitable? Was life any better for dwarves in that other go-to civilization, ancient Egypt? Egypt was a more catch-all society for people with disability, and I'm interested to find out if this extended to people with dwarfism.
So this is an ivory figurine of a dwarf from the site of Hierakonpolis in the south of Egypt, about 5,000 years old. This is actually made of hippopotamus ivory. This would have been a very, very expensive and prestigious material. So the fact that we have a dwarf statuette carved out of this material, I think demonstrates the respect and reverence given to these individuals in Egyptian society.
Weren't then treated like the comic figures that they were in ancient Rome?
No, absolutely not. They were very much part of the elite society, and they could be anything from scribes to priests. They occasionally held very high court titles. In later periods, dwarves were so integrated into Egyptian society that certain gods took on the form of dwarfs. And here we have the god Bes. Bes was a protector god of pregnant women during childbirth and used to ward off evils. This is an amulet representing the dwarf god Pataikos. He was another guardian god.
I think it's quite nice to think that, you know, people with dwarfism, at least in one society, were so highly revered that they ended up gods. It's a very different approach to the approach taken by classical Greece and Rome.
From the earliest period, the Egyptians integrated all different types of people into their society.
For me, the most dignified depiction of a dwarf in the ancient world is of Seneb, a high-ranking court official of ancient Egypt 4,500 years ago. Thought to be the first portrait of anybody, let alone a dwarf, it shows him with his loving family by his side. Egyptian society's attitude towards people with dwarfism was much more open-minded. They portrayed dwarves as ordinary people. But sadly, it seems, it's the Greek and Roman ideas that we've chosen to follow. But it's made the lives of people with dwarfism a hell of a lot tougher.
As a child, there was no real positive image in the media. I think the only time we saw someone with dwarfism was in sort of fantasy films.
Quite often, there will be jokes or roles that are made to continue stereotypes that ridicule and humiliate people.
One of the oldest cliches is that of the evil dwarf, with its roots grounded in European folklore. From Alberich in Wagner's Ring Cycle to the 7 dwarfs of the Brothers Grimm in the original fairy tales. And in these myths, dwarves are depicted not only as evil, but as not even human. Professor Diane Purkis has the delightful pleasure of studying fairy tales for a living. What can you tell me about the mythology that's built up around dwarfism?
They're typically in folklore not just small humans, but a separate race from humans, as different from humans as lions, in that they're not understood as disabled humans. Virtually as soon as Grimm's fairy tales start to be published for children, they start being published in illustrated editions. One of the most influential illustrators at the turn of the 19th century is Arthur Rackham, partly because he's utterly brilliant. But he also is the one who re-envisages dwarf characters with the characteristic cap with the tassel, the big nose, the long white beard.
Over here we've got the 7 dwarves, is this right?
Yes.
I just find it fascinating that these characters are universally male, universally evil, and universally have the same characteristics.
With the beards and the
Well,
thick
they're
hair.
animalistic.
Yeah, it's deeply creepy, actually, because it is very dehumanizing and estranging.
Is there any example in any of these stories anywhere of, for lack of a better word, a good dwarf?
Not really. Dwarves, just like fairies and elves and leprechauns, really represent the darkness at the heart of human beings. It's like we want to hive off the darkness in ourselves and give it to some other group of people. We can't acknowledge or bear the fact that we're greedy, or that we're immoral, or that we're conniving.
Again, we represent dwarves to disguise flaws in ourselves. Do you think the mythology has an effect on how people perceive real people with dwarfism?
I think it makes us a little bit, inverted commas, special, which when you're an ordinary human, you want to walk down the street and you don't necessarily want to feel special. You want to get from A to B and be able to mind your own business. I likened the dwarves of fairy tales in a same way that I'd sort of seen actually gollywogs in fairy tales.
Sure.
You've got a representation of a certain look that exists in the real world, and then you've abstracted it and turned it into a magical fairy creature. When I go grocery shopping, I'm not shopping dwarfishly. You know what I mean? It's not magical or
Just
special
shopping.
that I'm shopping. There isn't enough representation of people with dwarfism being ordinary.
As the ordinary lives of people with dwarfism are shown so rarely, it's the mythical images which predominate. And you don't have to be a dwarf to be impacted by this. Christina Gray never thought about this issue until her son Samuel was diagnosed with a form of dwarfism known as achondroplasia. And since his birth, she has been alarmed by the impact of fictional representations of dwarfs on her and her family.
When he was a toddler, I was in a shopping mall, pregnant with my youngest child, and some guy said something, oh, if you brought his 6 brothers, you'd get a good deal. When he was 6 weeks old and I went for the 6-week check at the doctor's with my beautiful baby boy in my arms, the doctor said to me, oh, he'll probably get a job in the entertainment industry or the circus. And I was shocked. I said, well, actually, he could be a teacher, he could be an accountant, he could be a doctor. So when he started school, I wanted a positive book that he could read himself, share with his friends, even for his siblings to be able to explain their brother's condition. I searched for positive stories out there about children with dwarfism, and I couldn't see any. Everything I saw was either fictional fairy tale, not real or true to life for somebody living with the condition.
So Christina wrote her own book, Strong and Mighty Max, basing the central character on Samuel. What do you think of this book?
It's really cool.
Yeah. Do you want to go through it with me?
That's me. I'm dreaming that I can be a superhero. I want to fly, I want to climb a rock, I want to swim to the deepest part of the ocean.
What would you find there?
Gold?
Gold? You reckon? Well, that'd be useful.
The doctor's putting a special thing around my mum's tummy, and the doctor's saying that it's a special occasion. It's not some kind of superpower. But I've got achondroplasia.
Achondroplasia? Yeah. And what's that?
It makes my bones grow shorter than others people. It's very important.
What do you want to do when you grow up?
A lot of stuff.
Like what?
Like police, fireman, flying in an aeroplane.
It's been a pleasure to meet you. You're quite marvellous. You want to shake my hand? Do you want to arm wrestle?
Okay.
This arm, you're going to win. Ah, you won straight away. That was rubbish. Right now, there are no limits to Samuel's ambitions. His mum's book has taught him to dream big, and that's how it should be. Historically, there are images of real dwarves out there, but as with the myths, they're deeply loaded. From the 1500s, dwarves were collected by royalty and are frequently shown with an aristocratic hand on their heads, aggrandising their new masters. The images are saying, "I'm protecting you because you belong to me." In this era, dwarves were brought into the very epicentre of high society, but they were kept, quite literally, at arm's length. I've met with historian Dr. John Wolfe at Lancaster House in London to view a rarely seen painting attributed to the Flemish Baroque painter Hendrik van Steenwyck the Younger. It features Geoffrey Hudson, one of the earliest court dwarfs in England. Who are we looking at in this painting?
So in the door frame there, we got King Charles I and his wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. And of course, in the centre to the left there, we have Geoffrey Hudson, the court dwarf. For me, this painting really breaks from the tradition of depicting dwarves as creatures of mythology, steeped in symbolism. Here we have a natural portrait, so realistic, in fact, that it almost appears to be a snapshot into court life. This was probably painted in Charles I's palace, Theobald's, near Enfield. Geoffrey is in the inner sanctum, yet he's separate, yet he's apart. Dwarves were there as entertainers, they were there as curiosities.
Geoffrey Hudson's story reveals a lot about the place of these prized curiosities in the royal palace. In Hudson's case, he was very much a cherished possession of Queen Henrietta Maria.
Behind this Watergate was York House, and it was in York House that Geoffrey first met the Queen. Footmen bring in a massive pie. It's about 2 feet high and 2 feet wide.
What comes out of the pie?
Good old Geoffrey. Geoffrey jumps out of this pie. He was in this miniature suit of armour, and he had a little flag, and he started like marching up and down this banqueting table, waving this flag. He then kind of returns to the Queen, looks at her, and takes a low, deep bow.
And she's in love with Geoffrey Hudson.
She's besotted.
I mean, a lot of people might think that is quite a demeaning thing to do, to sort of serve someone with dwarfism up in a pie. How do you think that was meant?
I think you probably could see it akin to dwarf tossing, or even that unscrupulous dwarf theme park in China. And, you know, within the court, the dwarf was very much like a loved pet.
Geoffrey moved in with Queen Henrietta Maria to Denmark House, where Somerset House now stands, and he's pictured here in an engraving by George Glover. Called Three Prodigies, it shows him with the oldest man in Britain and one of the tallest men, who lived with him here at Denmark House. There were 3 other people with dwarfism in the court, but as a proportionate dwarf, Geoffrey Hudson was prized above all of them. The engraving shows the fascination that the society of the time had with abnormal bodies. Outside the court, dwarves were displayed alongside bearded ladies and other so-called monstrosities for public spectacle in an early incarnation of the freak show. Geoffrey fought for his country in the English Civil War, but his lasting memorial will be as part of this oil painting of Queen Henrietta Maria by Flemish artist Anthony van Dyck, a leading painter of British royalty. Hudson is shown with a monkey called Pug, 2 pets of the royal household. Dwarves are pictured with dogs and monkeys in dozens of paintings. The implication? They're little higher in status than the animals that share their household. Within the royal palaces of Europe, dwarfs had become ubiquitous, and nowhere more so than in Madrid. And under the reign of King Philip IV, dwarfs would gain a much more prominent role in court life. How many dwarfs did Philip IV have in the court?
Along his whole reign, we know of over 100 dwarfs and jesters.
Where did they find them?
We hear of court members who would go over to a hospital to look for a dwarf with a donation.
Right, so they basically bought them from the hospitals?
Yes, yes.
So what was life like outside?
The fact that they are in court is a better life for them, because what was the alternative for them? To be on the roadside or to be kept in cages, to be shown in fairs.
Right. So what was court like for the dwarfs?
They are present in everyday life with royal children or with a queen. They would sometimes criticize you, tells the story about the parsley sauce and the mustard. The king is having a meal in the company of a dwarf. A messenger comes in with the bad news that the city has been lost. And the king remains impassive and continues eating with a parsley sauce. And the jester, he swears, he says, "Cuerpo de Dios, Cuerpo de Dios, for goodness sake, get some mustard so that it would put a bit of temper in your nose."
And no noble could say that?
No, of course not. Of course not. I think you'd have your head chopped off if you said that, being a duke. Yeah. But if you're a jester, you're allowed.
Within the court of King Philip IV was Diego Velázquez, a painter of rare skill who, in a radical break with art tradition, would make dwarfs the subjects of his paintings and not the decorative figures on the fringes. I've seen these paintings many times in reproductions, but here at the Prado Gallery, I'm seeing the originals for the very first time. Las Meninas. It's this painting that first got me thinking about the place of dwarfs in art. On the surface, it's a portrait of the royal family. But it includes Marie Barbola, a woman with achondroplasia, and Nicolasio Pertusato, a proportionate dwarf. As you stare at the painting looks back at you. It draws you in, and as it does so, your mind begins to play tricks on you. It's as if Velázquez is staring out of the image and it's you who is being painted. That's what conventional art history says, and it's true. But the really fascinating thing for me about this painting is that while at one level it appears to be a portrait of the Infanta, the young princess, lit up in the middle, at another level it kind of just dispenses with royalty altogether. The Infanta is just a small girl, visiting her mother and father, the king and queen, as they're having their portrait painted. But the king and queen are relegated to mere reflections in a mirror on the far wall. The real centrepiece of this painting is the German dwarf Marie Barbola. She completely dominates the right-hand side of the painting, and no matter where you look, your gaze is always pulled back to her, and then she stares out at you as if to say, "What are you looking at?" She has an aura of self-contained gravitas, her hands mirroring those of Velázquez in the painting. In a radical departure from royal portraits of the era, Velázquez presents Marie as a real person and not as an object or a thing. This painting is a recognised landmark in the history of art, but for me, it's also a standout moment in the history of disability. Mercedes, what can you tell me about the two dwarves in Les Meninas?
Nicolasio is younger. He's well proportioned. He was forever doing pranks and somersaults, that sort of thing. Marie Barbola is dressed exactly like a court lady, and she is given 4 pounds of snow a day.
Snow?
Yes, snow. Snow was important because it kept your drinks cold, in the summer.
That shows that she was important.
Yes, absolutely.
As well as Las Meninas, Velázquez made at least 10 portraits of dwarves. This must surely have reflected a personal mission. This is thought to be a portrait of Sebastian de Mora, servant to Prince Balthazar Carlos. Here, Velasquez portrays one of the court dwarfs with all the humanity and all the sensitivity that he would a pope or a king. He's done it without any sense of scale, so you don't really notice the stature, and he's portrayed his anguish and his despair. It's probably the first time since the ancient Egyptians that someone had started portraying dwarfs with any kind of dignity. This portrait, from 1644, is of Don Diego de Acedo. In this painting, Velasquez has portrayed the man with a vast book, which does emphasise his small stature. But what he's also saying, and I think it's much more important, is that the man is clever, that he can read, that he can write, that he's erudite. And that's the most important thing about this person. As befits his station as Keeper of the King's Seal, he's dressed as a gentleman. His eyes and a high forehead emphasise his intelligence. Whether speaking truth unto power or keeping the king's accounts, these dwarves were valued as individuals with something rich to offer court society, and Velázquez captured their uniqueness. Velázquez painted these dwarves with real feeling.
There's obviously, a feeling of family, friendship almost. He's somebody warm-hearted, but really Velázquez is a great artist, not only in drawing or light or whatever, but he's also a great artist in the deepest sense, in the sense of bringing back to you a human being, a character.
I think when you see the Velázquez paintings in real life, they're quite astounding. His images of dwarfs are the most touching I've ever seen. I mean, he conveys the humanity of his subjects, the depth, the personality. It was really interesting listening to Mercedes talk to me about the role of dwarves. At least they had a position of privilege in some respects. And free snow. I want free snow. Velázquez showed the world what should have been blindingly obvious, that people with dwarfism deserved more than to be treated as loved pets or monarchs' playthings. They possessed deep intelligence and a profound humanity. Back in the UK, another singular milestone was about to be reached. For the first time, a person with dwarfism was on the cusp of recognition as an artist in their own right. His name was Richard Gibson, and I've been given a rare glimpse of this portrait of him, made by the studio of his friend, Sir Peter Lely, as it undergoes conservation work here at the National Portrait Gallery. Gibson learnt his trade at the Mortlake Tapestry Works, and with the restoration of King Charles II, he entered the Royal Palace as an official court painter. In a reversal of the status quo, a dwarf was now the one casting his gaze on average height people. It seems somewhat ironic, but when Richard Gibson finally made a name for himself as an artist, it was through painting miniature portraits. But in the 1600s, there was nothing diminutive about miniatures. I'm meeting art consultant Emma Rutherford to find out how Richard Gibson was regarded as an artist. Emma, what light can you shed on the life of Richard Gibson?
We think he had a very thriving practice. We have letters that say, I'm trying to get my portrait painted by Gibson, but he's just too busy, and I'm basically in a queue.
These are quite remarkable.
They are painted in watercolour. Things like the shine on the hair would be really, really difficult to achieve.
I mean, the detail's amazing. And this sounds ridiculous, but did they have, like, tiny little miniature brushes and magnifying glasses?
They had small brushes, which were quite fat and came down to a single hair point. So that's Barbara Villiers, who was one of the most famous mistresses of Charles II. Being a dwarf allowed Gibson access to circles which other miniature painters didn't necessarily have access to. Gibson's personality and his social skills would have been really, really important. So this miniature has always traditionally thought to have been a self-portrait of Richard Gibson, but we're not 100% sure.
It looks exactly like all the other portraits of him.
There are definite physical similarities, but we don't have anything else to support it.
Do you know that's ridiculous, don't you?
Not to a historian.
As far as we can tell, Gibson wasn't viewed as either a slave or as an object, and he didn't have to jump out of a pie. What Gibson did prove was that a dwarf could carve out a career as a highly successful and skilled artist, and not just be some curious inspiration to others. In Sweden, another artist with dwarfism, Andreas von Benn, was making waves with his own acclaimed miniatures. While in Germany, artist, calligrapher and magician Matthew Buckinger, born without hands or feet, was achieving acclaim for his illustrations. Specialising in micrography, he's pictured here in a self-portrait, with intricately drawn psalms forming the curls of his hair. It's thought he created them with a quill pen held between his arms. But for dwarves, there was no great turning point. The battle for acceptance was just beginning. It's in the 18th century that we get the first real clue of how it felt to be a court dwarf, from writer and performer Joseph Borowski. After being expelled from the Polish court for marrying an average-height woman, Borowski travelled across the salons of Europe as a writer and performer. He's portrayed here in great finery, suggesting a rather privileged life, but he's also pictured by a full-size chair, appearing to be defined by his size. So which sums him up best? His frank autobiography reveals a man who longed to be accepted as a gentleman, but always felt looked down upon.
Those would be much mistaken. Who should imagine that, seduced by the repeated kindness bestowed on me? I did not labour under painful feelings, only looked upon by others as a doll. A little more perfect, it is true. But, however, only as an animated toy.
Historian Simon Webb has brought me to Durham Town Hall to see a life-size sculpture of Borowski. I really quite like this statue, actually. I think it's quite a warm representation.
You notice that this button is undone. It's a sign of a gentleman. You don't do everything absolutely right. He wanted to be respected as a civilized person. He's thinking, well, are people charmed by me just because I'm a tiny guy? Or is there something about me that they can see that can shine out, some talent, some personality?
Throughout his life, Borowski was on exhibition as a dancer, a violinist, and even gawped at in his home for the price of a shilling. He was told by the French ambassador,
You must needs give up pride or choose misery. And if you do not intend to lead the most unhappy life, it is indispensable you resolve to make exhibition of yourself.
But Borowski rose in stature through a combination of charm and considerable talent. He travelled across Europe as a dancer and musician, finally ending up in England. He yearned to be accepted by the highest echelons of society, and did eventually gain an audience with the British royal family. Towards the end of his life here in Durham, Borowski was living an independent and self-reliant existence, and was recognised as the gentleman he'd always strived to be. So Simon, this is where Borowski is buried, is it?
Yep, 1837. He died at the age of 97. The Prince Regent said if he had 12 sons, he would introduce all of them to Borowski, because he was such an example of a talented, entertaining gentleman.
Prior to that, he was basically a performing dwarf. However, you want to dress it up. On the final page of his autobiography, Borowski offers these reflections.
My statues irrevocably excluded me from the common circle of society. Few people seem to take notice of me being a man, an honest man, a man of feeling. How painful are these reflections?
Borowski revealed, through his writing, that although painted as a gentleman, he was ultimately defined by his size, an ornament of the upper classes. As the fashion for court dwarves faded, they became ornaments in the literal sense. Instead of paying their shilling to see a dwarf on display, the English aristocracy began to keep porcelain dwarfs in their own homes, and eventually their gardens. Twigs, what have we got here?
These are little porcelain figures made by Crown Derby, 18th and 19th century. They're based on a very famous set of engravings by Jacques Callot. He did a whole series of grotesques, as he called them, modelled on real dwarfs. And in the 18th century, they become the models for these Crown Derby mansion house dwarfs.
Why are they called mansion house dwarfs?
Believe it or not, they used to have real dwarfs with signs, usually on their hats, and they used to stand outside the mansion house in the City of London, advertising things.
How do we end up with gnomes in gardens?
When Sir Charles Isham created his very large rockery at Lamport Hall, he looks around for something that will look in scale with what he is attempting to show as a real mountain. What does he find? A series of porcelain figures.
It's as if the aristocracy needed to reassert the idea that a dwarf's natural place was on display. In Germany, dwarf figurines designed specifically for the garden were already popular, inspired not by real dwarves, but by the little helpers of Germanic folklore. So in 1847, Sir Charles brought 21 of them to England, and there's one surviving example. Lampy.
There he is, the oldest gnome in England.
Still got a smile on his face.
Charles Isham, in Notes on Gnomes and Remarks on Rock Gardens, talks about the fact that he would not have allowed gnomes or fairies or dwarves into the rock garden if he said they hadn't existed.
Seeing and hearing must no longer be indicative of mental delusion, but rather extension of faculty, which is quite remarkable for this, like, well-educated member of the aristocracy to believe these things were real. But while the Victorian aristocracy was playing around with its gnomes, what was happening to real people with dwarfism? No longer prized by the upper classes, dwarves would be ogled at by the masses in the Victorian freak show. Early photography provided a new lens through which to view these freak show performers, who were promoted through postcards known as carte de visite. It wasn't enough that these people were small. Showmen like American P.T. Barnum dressed them up in grand outfits to exaggerate their difference still further.
This was taken by quite a famous photographer, Matthew Brady.
This is the same Matthew Brady that photographed the American Civil War.
Yes, those intense images of the Civil War. And then he does this kind of photography as well.
Taken in Brady's studio, these photographs were staged weeks before the ceremony, selling for 25 cents each. Dwarfs had become a commodity. Are there any English examples?
Yes, this is Harold Pyatt, Tiny Tim.
The way that they photograph the characters in these cards, they deliberately emphasise their smallness.
Often children were used, passed off as adults. Growth was restricted through consumption of gin. They were more valuable to a family, potentially, as a performer than they were just, as another mouth to feed.
Tom Thumb, it didn't really matter, because every postcard sold made you money. But if you were like a 5-year-old girl in a Victorian freak show who's being dressed up like an adult and fed gin, then, it was pretty bloody awful.
As well as these images being used for commercial purposes, they were also used in medical textbooks. This is quite obviously a carte de visite. Underneath, there are heights and sometimes weights as well. The medical profession
can't cure them. So they want to look at them, measure them, and understand them.
But of course, it wasn't until the 1990s that they identified chromosome 4 as the point at where dwarfism is caused.
We're talking 25 years ago. I mean, that's astonishing. That's so recent. Measured for medical textbooks and dressed up for postcards, dwarfs were viewed as deviants and freaks. It goes to show history doesn't always move in a positive direction. By the 50s, the freak show had faded, but dwarfs continued to be displayed in the circus. Artist Peter Blake remembers seeing them as a young man. Did you ever come across any people mocking people with disabilities?
I'm sure it happened. I mean, they were there to be mocked, certainly gawped at. And dwarfs can do incredibly funny things in the circus. I mean, the way they fall down, for instance, and don't have far to fall. So the way they can just kind of kick their feet away and fall onto their bottom is very funny. But then that's what they're trying to be.
You've quite often featured those kind of marginal characters in your work?
I've got an enormous collection of postcards. I mean, this is probably a tenth of it.
And they're from your personal collection, all those cards?
Yeah. I actually saw this one in the Goose Fair in Nottingham. And he's probably the last dwarf that actually kind of exhibited. This was in the 60s, so I have an affection for him. I bought the postcard from him.
Peter Blake incorporated this collection of carte de visite into a set of alphabet prints, calling it D for Dwarfs and Midgets. The title reflects a generational shift. Today, people with dwarfism are no longer given alienating titles like midgets, leprechauns or freaks. Now the dwarf community don't use the word midget.
No, I imagine not. And I'm beginning to accept that I mustn't use the word freak, whereas I thought, look, this is what it's always been. I refuse to bow to political correctness, but suddenly it doesn't seem right to use it. My interest has always been that difference is important and usually beautiful. So that's always been my approach to differences, to celebrate them rather than be nervous of them. Everybody's different, but one should find beauty in the difference rather than be frightened of it.
It's heartening to see that Peter Blake has changed his mind about how he refers to people with disability. As an artist, Peter Blake saw something to be celebrated in all of these performers, but I'm not sure his reaction was really typical. I think for each person who celebrated these performers, there were many, many more who jeered and mocked them. Today, the different bodies of people with dwarfism are still a commoditised form of entertainment. So what impact does that have on their everyday lives?
There's definitely a misconception that people with dwarfism are to be put on display for public entertainment and ridicule, rather than to be engaged with and actually given an opportunity to use their voice. Even just the concept that we're all working in circus and those kinds of stereotypes, I mean, they're still out there. You know, like, there's nothing freakish about me. It's not like, you know, people with dwarfism are creepy and magical. We're just people, you know, and bits of us are smaller and our bones didn't grow as long. People very rarely meet someone with dwarfism in real life, so all they see are the clown stereotypes. They don't sort of ever see the human everydayness of being a person in a body that's different.
And for me, the person who really captures this human everydayness is photographer Ricardo Gill. At 3'9", he captures images of the world from his unique viewpoint, forcing you to look at the world in an inherently different way. Even mundane details feel utterly fresh, be it a paper bag or the counter of a coffee shop, and they appear to break conventional rules of photography, cutting off the heads of average height people. Ricardo's agreed to talk to me from his local cafe in Puerto Rico. Did you have a particular ethos when you did these photographs of kind of torsos and legs?
Well, I can't help but photograph from that viewpoint. I can't shoot down at my subject. I can only shoot up or shoot across. You know, it's like this, or up here, and sometimes down here. It's just my perspective. It's like when I hung a show in California, I requested the curator hang all my photographs at my eye level. Well, I wanted to see my work.
Yeah. How did normal-sized people react to that fact that pictures were hung at not their eye level?
Well, I wanted to see my work. I could care less what the people thought. But I mean, let them come down a little bit. I just wanted my photographs hung at a level that myself, a dwarf, and my dwarf friends and family could enjoy. It's not just from a dwarf perspective, but from human perspective. I was documenting my family as we were growing up. Growing.
For me, the most moving of these photographs is the one of his then wife holding their daughter in her arms.
To me, it's a Madonna and child. How are we the same? How are we not the same? I guess that's my ongoing question. I'm the same as you, but I'm not.
Yeah, I get that. Where do you see the art movement at the moment for people with restricted growth, and where do you see it going? I mean, do you think it's getting better, worse, staying the same?
I really don't know, and I really don't care.
Why don't you care?
A teacher a long time ago told me, just work, just work. Don't worry about the exhibition.
I can't help but love Ricardo. His photographs clearly stem from a singular personal vision, and that's surely the mark of any great artist, with dwarfism or not. Tom Shakespeare has created a triptych that stems from an equally unique intellectual perspective, engaging with some of the big issues affecting us all. Tom, tell us the history of this piece of work. I believe it's called Incarnate.
It goes birth, life and death, impairment and death, really. This is based on a painting by Henry Fuseli, and it's of the nightmare. When I saw it, I thought, wow, this lady could be pregnant, she could be fantasizing or worrying about having a disabled child. This goblin that's sitting on her chest is actually her fears. We recreated it as exactly as we could. So she's got a hospital band on. On the night table are folate tablets which stop you having a child with spina bifida. So I wanted to do a piece that was really about anxiety and pressure. This is an image of a painting by Mantegna called Dead Christ. And Mantegna is experimenting with perspectives. And if you look at the original, it's very, very foreshortened.
It does look like someone with achondroplasia.
It could be someone with achondroplasia. I thought, wouldn't that be interesting if I put myself in and recreated as a person with achondroplasia and made myself look tall? And what I want to play with is the perspective and not sure whether it's tall or short.
So tell me about the middle one. Obviously, Francis Bacon influenced.
It's called Figure With Me. This is the Pope. In the original, he's just a piece of meat like everybody else. Yeah. I became paralysed in 2008. And so actually I'm in a wheelchair here. Being in this huge wheelchair when I'd always been mobile was like being in prison. Sure. And you feel very powerless, you feel very angry, you feel very unhappy. It's a cry of rage and despair, really, because when I was first paralysed, I wanted to kill myself. I was miserable as hell. This is trying to express that difficulty that I had. So it's a very personal piece. But I hope they're not just about disability, they're about anybody, all bodies. We're all vulnerable to this. Every woman's pregnancy is affected by this. So, yeah, I wanted them to be shocking.
Tom Shakespeare has taken control over how he represents himself. But, more significantly, both he and Ricardo Gill have taken us inside their heads, revealing the universal concerns that we all share. We've been so bombarded with loaded images of dwarves through history that I think frequently artists have failed to see any common ground underneath the physical differences. So people sitting for portraits don't know for certain if they're being looked at with an exploitative gaze. How does the experience feel being painted, being looked at?
I felt really comfortable with it, but I'm going to say that was specifically because Tanya is also disabled. And that actually made a really big difference to how I felt she was looking at me. It is remarkable that you and I and every other disabled artist goes on despite the prejudice. You know, getting out of bed in the morning and facing other people's bollocks, literally in my case, or, you know, their metaphorically bollocky behaviour. Like, that is amazing.
It is easier for artists with disabilities to see through the stereotypes, but are people with dwarfism being fairly represented by society at large?
We are considered to be socially acceptable to poke fun at.
I think the depiction of dwarfism is improving, but I think it's very slow. But I think with enough encouragement, I think we'll certainly get there, yes.
20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have had a black news presenter or a black weather forecaster. And I think the more we see people with dwarfism in the media, in popular roles, whatever they might be, doing something that is not related to their height, I think that will normalise the condition.
I would like to see in art and in entertainment and in storytelling the truth. And the truth is, people who are bent, broken, a bit disfigured, disabled, who are different, are everywhere. And they've got stories that are as rich and interesting and worthy of telling as anybody else.
There's a tendency to see disabled people as separate from society, as somehow other, And nothing shows this more clearly than the way that dwarfs have been and are represented. But every time we see a strong work by or about a person with dwarfism, that chips away at those stereotypes. Because, of course, people with disabilities aren't other. They're just part of society, like you. Just a bit different, that's all.